In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
All right. Hello, Sublation media viewers and magazine readers. Welcome to the Sublation Magazine Show. This is Sublation Media's weekly live stream in which we speak with our authors and discuss some of the issues of the day and their relevance to the left. I'm Douglas Lain.
And I'm Ashley Frawley.
And before we begin, I would like to ask all of you who are watching to subscribe and hit the bell and find us on Facebook and on Twitter so you can keep up to date with what Sublation Magazine is publishing. And if you have the means, please consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link in the description. Also, if you're feeling really flush and you're inclined to, you can drop us a super chat. The super chat this week are enabled, so you can give us money directly right now, which that's like we're like dancing monkeys for you, and we'd love to get your super chats. So, Ashley, what are we going to be talking about this week?
Oh, well, we talk about something other than the fact that I have something in my eye.
Okay.
Well, but this week we have got a great show. We've got a great show. We'll be talking about the overall state of the economy and, of course, the contradictions under which we live in capitalism. And in particular, we're going to be looking at a news item from July 8th, which was titled "A Robust June Jobs Report Clouds the Outlook for the U.S. Economy." So when considering the U.S. economy or the world economy, sometimes it's easy to get fixated on some of the kind of indicators in a really fragmented way. So we want to bring in a big picture and ask what's going on. What's with this talk about the stock market or housing or unemployment figures? How can we understand this? Obviously, from a Marxist perspective, but also just as people, what should we do? And so we're going to try to think through things a bit systematically, which is tricky and can sometimes be controversial.
Yeah. But that one of the things about the AP article and this jobs report is that we're being asked to think about more than one indicator at a time and put together a kind of bigger picture, because you would think that a robust jobs report, lots of people going to work, would just be overall good news for the economy, but the forecast is still rather gloomy, and we should think about why that would be the case. Why could it be? How could it be that when people are working and we're supposedly more productive because of that, we could still have an uncertain future?
Yeah, and well, people are working, but consumer spending is down, home sales are falling, and the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates in an effort to combat inflation. It seems to me they're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, because they want to raise interest rates to try to deal with inflation, but if they do that, they could easily trigger a recession. And the article that we'll talk about, we've got a great guest that we'll bring on in a moment. One of my favorite people to talk to. Of course, just Marxist economics is what gets me up in the morning. He's going to help us to figure out some of that big picture, because the article that we're referring to really tried to kind of make it sound like it's the Fed's fault. So like if there's a recession, it's the Fed. The Fed was messing with things and we could have got out. We're at this turning point in the economy where we can choose. We can continue to have growth, or we can raise interest rates and cause a recession. And it would be like, it wasn't saying this outright, but it seemed to imply that if the wrong decision is made, then we'll wind up in a recession. But I think things are a bit more systemic than that.
It almost seemed to me that a recession would be worth it if it could slow down inflation. Like the concern was more about the long-term consequences of inflation than maybe a short-term recession. I don't know though. I mean, but there was like the economists were like, oh, well, the jobs report is stronger than we would have expected. So maybe all of our efforts to slow down the economy aren't working. And what would that mean? But yeah, so we have Ted Reese, right, ready to talk to us about the state of the economy.
So Ted is someone who's fairly sure that a recession is on the way. He is the author of The End of Capitalism from Zero Books, a book that I very proudly solicited. And I'm sad that we're no longer with Zero, obviously, but I, of course, think you should go out and buy that book. It's looking really good, and a lot of people have actually picked it up from what I have heard. So we're going to talk to Ted, who can maybe give us a sense of what's going on at the moment. How is it possible that businesses are still hiring, and yet growth seems to be sluggish, and economists have been saying, look, a recession might be looming. What exactly is going on here?
All right, Ted, welcome to Sublation Magazine, the show.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So, Ted, what do you think about, I sent you the article. What do you think about the latest job report in the US? Obviously, some of the highlights from the article that they said that inflation is at a 40-year high. Was that one of the points? And this is a similar case also in the UK. So what was your take? How do we make sense of this moment that's been, as I mentioned before, described as a turning point?
Yeah, so job growth was about 50% higher than anticipated on a month-on-month basis. So they're expecting 250,000 and they got 370,000, and so that was like there was a bit of a surprise at that all round, and I'm a little bit surprised by it. But the thing is that the Federal Reserve is managing to play some certain tricks with the way it is pushing cash into the market without pushing the interest rate below zero, and obviously it's going back up now. But there was a time before where it was still pushing printing money and buying up treasuries, but without forcing companies and investors to buy short-term bonds, basically forcing them to buy the longer-term ones so as to not push interest rates below zero. I can go into a bit more detail on that. But the other thing that's really happened is that there's some recovery because the supply chains are being built back up to some extent again. So we've got high inflation and one of the reasons for that is the supply chain breakdown due to the combination of the crash that was looming and the lockdowns and the pandemic, and the combination that basically brought about a crash, and we got the millions, tens of millions unemployed, and then slowly people coming back into work, and then quite quickly coming back at one stage. But yeah, like you say, we've now got this situation where they still got this problem where people are coming back into work. That's going to have an inflationary effect. Mm-hmm. They're just stuck between a rock and a hard place, and it's just they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. But they're gonna, because the thing is, when you get the deflationary effects, which we had for a while during lockdown, that will over time generate the ability to hire more staff on lower wages per head sort of thing, and that will get things going again and cheapen commodities and all the rest of it. But because they couldn't go below zero, you basically hit a wall, and so that you get the inflation, and at the same time you get the breakdown of the supply chains because a lot of businesses were going bust. And now we have, so what we had if you want to think of it in Marxist terms, is we had a rapid acceleration of surplus capital that became unprofitable essentially.
So you couldn't there was nowhere to invest the capital, is what you're saying?
Yeah, so it became what Marx and Grossman call over-accumulated capital. Mm-hmm. And then because of the deflationary period where prices fell a little bit, that created new demand to reconvert that surplus capital into productive capital once again. And so we started to see employment rising again. I think we're still seeing some of the after effects of that, combined with some of the tricks that they're playing in areas like the repo market or the reverse repo market. We can go into that. So that's kind of roughly how I would summarize it. But at the same time, there was another report that came out just before that that said that jobless claims edged up to the highest since January, and that planned layoffs were soaring. So the picture might be brighter this month on what's gone on the past month, but looking ahead, that's not the case.
Yeah, I was just going to ask one question about that, which is that along with this increase in employment, or the new jobs added, and a decline in unemployment figures in the United States, there's also a lower job participation rate in the United States. And it seems to me that over the last decade, maybe or more, the job participation rate has it's been slipping a bit. There's a lot of people now who may not be counted even as not part of that pool of labor at all, or potential labor, because they're just dead after COVID. So we've got I wonder to what degree COVID and the creation of a permanently unemployed class since 2008 is skewing our picture of unemployment, and should we take that into account?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the labour participation rate gives us a better picture of where things really are, and it's been declining for years. Anyway, it was 67.5% in the year 2000, 66% in 2008. And 62.8% in May 2019. So that's the long-term trend anyway. I don't have the latest figure exactly.
One of our viewers says that
by some of what you said, yeah.
According to Daniel Jacobs here, under Trump there was a jump, up for a little while in that.
Yes, his record-breaking tax cuts enabled higher employment, but then that led to higher inflation, and they started raising rates in August 2018, I think, or in the run-up to that period, and that started to have an inflationary impact. So they started cutting the interest rate again, and that was just before the pandemic started.
Now, Ted, correct me if I'm wrong, but you seem to be suggesting that it was mainly due to COVID that there has been that we're experiencing inflation at the moment. But I've seen you argue that we were headed for hyperinflation actually for quite a long time, even pre-COVID. So can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm just saying that we were due a crash in around August 2019. Growth was basically zero. It was zero in Britain and Germany. Some countries in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America were already in recession. So I was expecting like a panic around that time. The yield curve had inverted as well, which usually indicates a recession. That's where the interest rate is higher on the short-term debt rather than the longer, like on the 2-year debt compared to the 10-year debt. That's happened again recently as well. I think 2 or 3 times since March, an inverted yield curve. So it's looking more and more like a recession is coming on that basis. But yeah, before the pandemic, growth was basically zero. So I was expecting a recession then. And it had been, it had already been 10, 11 years since the Great Recession or the financial crisis. And we usually do get a recession or a crisis on average every 10 years. So and they had kept it going on the basis of this ever increasing debt machine, and in combination with things like austerity and more privatization and so on.
Actually, it's funny because I remember in 2007 when I very first got into podcasts, I used to walk around listening to podcasts all the time. And I was listening to some show on CBC radio in Canada, and some economist came on, and he was, I remember them saying, and next up, we'll talk to the leading economist and such, who says we will never experience another recession. And this was in 2007. He said, yeah, we fixed things. We, all these things that had caused these recessions in the past, this is, we've got past this now. It's not going to happen again. He goes into this very lengthy discussion. And it strikes me as interesting that recessions do happen fairly regularly. And yet there's this denial. There's this tendency to deny that they are baked into capitalism, or on the other hand, to naturalize them as business cycles. So is this just business as usual? Is on the one hand, sorry, I'm going to slam two questions together, but is this not business as usual? We'll just see a downturn, a recession, a slump, and then things will pick up again? Or two, is there a way that we could avert this and just keep things going? Is it just the way capitalism works? Or is there some way that we can, get around it, or something else entirely?
No, I'm afraid crisis is baked into the system. It needs every business cycle or cycle of capital accumulation at some point needs a recession, because it comes up against the system comes up against its own contradictions, where it's not exploiting enough labor and labor time relative to the amount of capital value that exists in the system. So if we abstract and say the total amount of surplus value generated is the total amount of labor time that is being appropriated from workers and going to the capitalists, that amount of surplus labor time or surplus value, it comes to a point where it's not enough to, Grossman uses the word valorize, to reproduce and expand the existing total capital value. And the reason that tends to happen is because as the capitalists innovate to raise the productivity of labor and to beat their competition, the amount of capital being employed in production tends to rise relative to the amount of labor being employed in production. So you therefore come up against this barrier of capital itself. This capital that becomes surplus becomes unprofitable to invest or reinvest. And then you get the crisis. And as I say, the system needs the crisis, because the crisis will then cheapen capital and commodities through, because it will force panic selling and price cutting. That will cheapen the price of commodities, which can also be bought up as means reduction. People will go out of work, and that will cheapen the cost of labor. The innovation that raises the productivity of labor will devalue commodities, so that will help in the same regard. So did I answer both questions then? I can't remember now.
Yeah, so basically what you're saying is that this is what the system needs. It needs a kind of reset. I know that word is tainted now, but it needs, so then isn't that, it might be painful, but this is creative destruction, right? That we will come out of it with a leaner, meaner capitalism. Is that not the argument? That's the kind of Schumpeter's naturalization of crisis is just these cycles. I mean, why is this such a big deal?
I mean, things have been getting worse with every crisis. I think that's very evident now. Like, if you look at the 2001 dot-com crash, and then 2008 was worse than that, and then 2020 was worse than that. And if you look, I think the really telling thing is if you look at the Federal Reserve's balance sheet, around 2008, 2009, it was $800 billion. A few years later, it was up to 4 trillion. And then by the time 2020 comes around and they're going for an even bigger bailout than before, is up to 8 trillion. So the Federal Reserve's balance sheet was pretty much near zero in relative terms. And then 10 years later, it's 10 times bigger. So what if in 10 years' time, it's 10 years bigger again, if this trend continues? The only alternative to that, or something like it, is probably a very deep depression, which would then would involve destroying far more masses of capital than we've seen in the previous two crises.
Would inflation help us overcome this debt problem by devaluing the currency that we owe in, so therefore, 8 billion or 8 trillion or whatever becomes comparable to 4 just by because of inflation? Could that happen? Is there an upside to inflation when it comes to these problems?
It's helping some capitalists because it's raising their prices, and they can command more per sale in that regard. But for most capitalists and most people in general, it's making life harder. So the smaller capitalists will find it more difficult to buy what they need to buy to run their business or to pay their bills, whether it's electricity or rent or whatever. And while that's going on, the bigger capitalists can ride out this higher inflation because they've got the reserves that the smaller capitalists don't. But at some point, the smaller capitalists won't be able to cope with this inflation anymore, and a lot of them will go bust, and then their capital can be bought up on the cheap by the bigger capitalists, and that will get things going again for the bigger capitalists. But the problem is I think the problem is, like, the overaccumulation of capital is so high, which is reflected in the level of debt, which is more or less at an all-time high. Well, it certainly was at the start of the pandemic. It was even higher than at the end of World War II in the US.
Just to say that, so the debt reflects overaccumulation. That is, the debt is reflecting capital that's not making profit because they've borrowed this money and can't be paid back with real productivity in the economy. Is that right?
Yeah, it more or less reflects the underproduction of surplus value.
Mm-hmm. So when we do find ourselves in recession, you're saying it's just deepening and deepening. Is it possible to just come out then leaner and meaner, or what would it take to get out of a recession? Because it seemed to me like in 2008, you needed a certain amount of capital destruction, but that didn't really happen. Because when you said it's getting worse and worse, I know people might be thinking like, well, it's not really, because yeah, some people had a really bad time, but it's not like the 1930s, we haven't seen anything like that. And I don't think anyone's really willing to repeat the 1930s again. So they'll do all sorts of things, because not just that they're not willing to repeat the human misery, but also it radicalized people.
Yeah, I think most capitalists want to avoid that. They want to not radicalize people. They don't want that level of misery. They don't want capitalism discredited, and so on and so forth. But there are capitalists out there that would be prepared to instigate a depression. The right-wing libertarians think that the problem is the Fed and the money printing and the debt purchasing, and that's the only problem. And if you just let the system correct itself, the free market correct itself, by prohibiting the Fed from doing this sort of thing, let it crash, let the unprofitable companies go bust, and then the system will correct itself. So they and other right wingers are perfectly prepared to do that at some point. But the bulk of the liberal conservative ruling class at the moment is using a combination of monetary and fiscal intervention to try and prevent that. And of course, the right wingers will also say, oh well, the fiscal intervention, that's to buy off the working class, or they'll even accuse the Fed of being communist or something like that. But of course, these are actually subsidies for capitalists, because capitalists need workers. They need to exploit workers to exist.
Yeah, it reminds me of the very same debate that played out in the 1930s as well, which was, well, let it all happen, let it all, let them eat dust, basically. And in the long run, things will correct itself. And that was the, Keynes' famous line, in the long run, we're all dead. But this is the crazy thing, too, about a recession. We live in a world of plenty. And yet we'll have to all just eat dirt for however long until this system corrects itself. I always tell my students, imagine you landed on a planet and it's full. It's it's plenty, and they've figured out how to produce enormous amounts of food and so on for everyone. And then you see it everyone's starving and they're burning the food. And you're like, what the hell is going on? They're like, well, we have these beans here, and everything has to kind of go in relation to these beans, and something's wrong with the beans, so we have to burn all the food. And you're like, what? This is exactly what people are basically asking us to stand for within capitalism.
Yeah.
But
I was just going to say, I think the problem is that we're reaching a stage where they're sort of running out of ways to devalue. I think you're probably going to ask me that next about automation and that sort of thing. I think we're coming up against the sort of ultimate barrier of capitalism, potentially, where devaluation is usually the main counter tendency used to overcome a crisis. But I think we're potentially coming towards a phase where that's just not going to be possible anymore because of the latest technological developments.
Well, what about war as a devaluation?
That's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah, but it accelerates devaluation. So it works both ways. It accelerates devaluation, and that gives capital accumulation some breathing room. It gives it new space to accumulate. But at the same time, it will speed up the development of automation because you'll get an arms race. Because that's the other side of World War II that doesn't get I don't think we talk about as much. It was a combination of the destruction of capital, but also the acceleration of innovation due to the arms race, which was socialized. So the cost of that innovation was socialized. And then they were commercialized and turned into profit because you could turn all these new innovations into commercial civilian products on the market. So and that's why you got the productivity boom. It was both of those reasons why you got the commodity boom, and capitalism was restored on a much higher level. But now, I've talked about the automation revolution being a second industrial revolution, which I think really got going in earnest sort of on the back of World War One, and is now coming to a point where you get this acceleration in innovation just because of the competition between the biggest capitalists and the biggest corporations. So Marx says that the expansion of production tends to happen on the newest technology more and more as the system gets older. So what we're going to see is even though there's a relative decline in the rate of innovation, the absolute amount of innovation is speeding up because of this intensifying. There's fewer competitors, but that means the competition between them is even fiercer. So the acceleration on things like artificial intelligence, and 3D printing, which is aimed from their perspective at reducing wages, because wages are still the highest, their highest outlay. And when they're in so much debt, they're going to be really looking at ways to reduce the outlay on wages. So 3D printing, artificial intelligence, and those things have reached a stage now where they're at a level where they're worth investing in as well.
Well, we've been talking for about just over 20 minutes, and I know that we have another guest. I wanted to ask you, things look pretty dire, and I wanted to ask you, how should what should it, like a regular person, what should you do in the face of this? If you have like, you're going to try to get on the property ladder, are we looking at another kind of 2008 crisis where all of a sudden you've basically just been renting your house from the bank? Like what should everyday people do in this kind of situation?
I mean, the main thing is to build, mutual aid or organizations where you're just building solidarity and supporting each other. And, we also need to build political organizations to start challenging this on a larger basis, on a more influential basis, because at the moment we're not being heard by enough people, I think, and we need more people to commit to trying to say what I'm saying, really, which is that the system is, reaching a historical peak, if you like, or a limit, whereby we're running out of ways to devalue capital, and we're running out of ways to keep accumulation going. So what I think we're going to see is hyperinflation followed by a depression of probably as bad as we've ever seen, unfortunately. So
go grow a garden and grow a movement as well at the same time. If all else fails, at least you'll have some lettuce and tomatoes to eat. I don't mean to make light of the situation. It's actually quite serious. But thank you so much, Ted, for coming on. For anyone who's interested, please pick up Ted's book, The End of Capitalism, the work of Henrik Grossman. And I don't know if you want to stick around for the after show. I didn't ask you that before, actually, but if you, please do, and we will pick your brain some more. Thank you so much for coming on.
No worries. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
All right. So, we have another guest coming right up. As Katerina Kolozova. I think I've said her name at least halfway right there. She has an article in Sublation Magazine right now called "The Concrete and the Abstract Beyond the Matter-Idea Dichotomy." This is, I think, an article that might be helpful as we try to return to a materialist politics. It's very theoretical, but I'm going to try to make her be concrete today. But first, we have to decide what it means to be concrete. So I'm going to bring Katerina Kolozova onto the stream, and there we go, like that. So hi, thank you for coming on to the Sublation Magazine Show. Again, I should tell everyone, go read sublationmag.com. New articles today by Conrad, one by you. And of
course, support us on Patreon, because that's what keeps the magazine running. Go.
That's right. Support us on Patreon and everywhere. So, again, just to start with, I'm going to ask you to do the big thing, which is, can you walk me through what the argument in your article and then in your upcoming book is all about? What are you arguing for when you talk about dialectical materialism?
Okay, this excerpt from a chapter in a book that is supposed to come out soon with you, I expect, I hope, is kind of a further explanation or an addition to a discussion that I open up in that chapter with certain readings of Zonrettel's notion of real abstraction. I believe that once this notion, this idea, this theory of Zonrettel re-emerged on the theoretical and philosophical and the leftist and Marxist scene in the past decade or more, in the previous decade, I would say, it kind of inadvertently smuggled in a way, reintroduced some sort of a covert presence of idealism once again in something which was supposed to be a vindication of proper materialist epistemology, as Zonrettel claims his epistemological project to be. The chapter discusses this notion of abstraction in materialist terms, as Zon Rettel intended. I believe that Zon Rettel is trying to be orthodox in his reading of Marx, to exact sort of to the letter, if you will, close reading of Marx, and recuperate the notion of abstraction, anything, even the notion of idea, for example, the concept of essence, etc., etc., in materialist terms. So if you remember some of the key passages in his work, in his book on real abstraction, you can see there that he insists that abstraction as such should not be left to the idealists, should not be relegated to the realm of discussions that belong to idealists, to or the strands of idealism within Marxism, but rather provide a materialist grounding for exploring the notion, or inventing a possibility of thinking abstraction in terms of materialist epistemology, as he intended, and as he believes Marx intended himself.
Okay, so I want to throw a picture of him up on the screen here for a moment. This is Son Rettel, at least as I found him on Google, and a very nice painting of him smoking a pipe. And he was a more orthodox Marxist than many of the French left in his day, right? He died in 1990. And when you talk about real abstractions, what comes to mind for me is the concept of the commodity fetish that you can find in Capital by Karl Marx. So this notion that an abstraction, one of his categories, value, can become a fetish, which means it can become materialized through commodity production, and that that what allows that to happen is not just one action in one moment in time, but the fact that already by the time this value is dictating the terms of society and the commodity has become a fetish, which means that it is not only the way in which we organize our material relations, but also seems natural or is reified and is practical. That all this can only happen once we have a concrete totality already in place. Like you already have a proletariat that's working. You already have enough mass production to create commodities fairly cheaply. And all of that seems pretty straightforward until you try to just pick out the terms and go, okay, so what does concrete mean here? Like when you say a concrete totality, that includes the abstraction of value that is also only generated once that's already in place. So what do you mean, and what does Son Rettel mean by things like concrete or material, and how is the split between an abstraction or an idea and the concrete material sensuous reality overcome by Marx or Son Rettel?
Okay, so yeah, I started from the end of the chapter and then kind of skipped straight to the beginning, and what links the two, the concrete and the opening discussion of Zon Rettel's notion somehow remained left out in my initial presentation. So the reference to Ilienkov and his notion of the concrete, and then Ilienkov's building on Lenin and his imperial criticism, materialism and imperial criticism, is there simply to divulge the fact that whatever we receive through particularly speculative realism and its appropriation of Zon-Rettel's theory is yet another, perhaps unwittingly executed reiteration of a form of idealism, covertly somehow sneaking into what is supposed to be a materialist idea. So I will arrive at Ilenkov's notion of concrete in a moment. Let me just explain Zon-Rettel's idea and why I needed Ilenkov's help in this article. So according to Zon-Rettel, we can speak of abstractions such as, for example, social relations. Social relations are real abstractions. So they are abstractions. We ought to affirm them as such, which does not mean that they do not have some sort of a material grounding for them. They are, in the last instance, as Althusser and Laruelle would say, materially grounded. They cannot, they do not exist outside the realm of the material. Yet again, these abstractions, while residing in this realm, on this plane of materiality, are indeed abstractions. And these abstractions, such as social relations, produce effects that are both real. So it's also very interesting in this respect. Zon-Rettel is very similar to François Laruelle. He makes this distinction between material and real. So the effects of this real abstraction are both real. So they produce some real effect, but these real effects are also bound to have some sort of a material effect as well. Nonetheless, the reality of abstraction itself is no less reality. Social relations are real. Well, now.
Okay, I gotta, as a dumb guy, I have to ask you to distinguish some things here. So, okay, so you say real and material, and I wanted to say, well, that's the same thing, right? I mean, but they're not. So could you tell me what the difference is in your thought here between
do you mean
the real
natural?
The real, the way I use it here, is very close to say, this is only to simplify the discussion and not to diverge into a completely different direction, is close, let's say, to the Lacanian notion of the real.
All right. So yeah. So the real is like the unspeakable, the unknowable,
it is knowable.
Beyond signification.
Oh, it is knowable.
It is knowable.
Oh.
The fact that we cannot penetrate it completely, control it, and equate it, conflate it with the idea does not mean that it is inaccessible to an idea, to human activity called thinking. That it does, the fact that it does not, that it cannot be equated, or you cannot put a perfect equation between the real and thought, the idea and real, does not mean that the real is inaccessible.
Okay.
Fully, let's say. It is accessible to a certain degree. It is accessible as much as we as cognizant beings can mediate its effects through the cognitive practice of thinking, be it folkish thinking, the manifest idea of reality, be it scientific thinking. Regardless of, we always already correlate with the real. We always already mediate the real through thought. This is in a way, let's say, partly Kantian stance, but not fully, because we do not declare the real irrelevant, inexistent, everything is an idea, everything is discursive or construct, everything is a product of a language, just because thought or language cannot fully control, fully envelop, fully relay the real.
Okay.
So
And
the
so
real is
with
accessible. But
yeah, the
let me add
material.
just one more
Okay.
thing.
Okay.
The material can manifest itself only through the real, only in the form of the real. And we can create, of course, language signification, which is another form of human practice to mediate these effects. And to this ability or this ambition, there are certain limitations. What scientific materialism tries to do, and why it calls itself scientific, and why I believe Marx called it scientific, is that materialism, as per the original project of Marx, and as I believe Zonrettel appropriated it, and as I believe François Leruel also makes an appropriation of it, admits certain limitations to thought's ambition, the limitations that sciences, for example, admit. Some sciences admit their imperfections, incapacities to fully mediate, explicate, convey to us the real or the outside reality. They always already depart from, a certain admission of our limitations to relate the real. So in this respect, Marx's project is really is indeed very akin to François Leruel's non-philosophy. So there is a certain philosophy there, but there is also a certain epoche, a certain distancing from living space blank with that non as a prefix. In the sense of admitting these inherent limitations to human thought that can never fulfill a certain Hegelian dream, for example, whereby, like the objective reality returns to thought, to human subjectivity, but this human subjectivity is gradually expands to a kind of an objective subjectivity. Paradoxically, I'm in a way parodying this idea the way Marx parodies it in his critique of Hegel's philosophy in general. So it returns to the idea, and then it becomes, here is the paradox: the real realizes itself through thought. Therefore, this is the Hegelian line of thinking. Therefore, the real, paradoxically or comically, becomes more real than the real itself. Once, elevated to the level of idea or spirit in Hegel, or in other strands of thought, perhaps in the entire history of Western philosophy, once conflated with thought, with human cognition, real or material, once conflated with the human cognition, it somehow becomes paradoxically, or it's not even a paradox actually, ridiculously more real than the real itself. So this is an obsession that every form of philosophical thinking has been haunted by or defined by, and it's always been there. That's why Marx insists that Feuerbach is not really a materialist, because he remains a philosopher. While remaining a philosopher, he always already remains an idealist. According to Marx, if you read closely his critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, there is no escape from idealism once you remain entrapped in philosophy. So this is the logic of it, and this is the comparison of it, of it all, of philosophy, of Marxist philosophy, with whatever purports to be science or Marxist science. So it's not just about pursuing certain sciences, the scientific disciplines themselves, but also exercising this kind of thinking that admits limitations to human thought, just as sciences do. So
I want to see if I can say something briefly that will summarize what you've been saying, and you can tell me if I've got this somewhat right.
Also, we've added Spencer to help us through some of this.
Yeah, but I'm trying to cut in, because once I let Spencer off his leash, I know that I'm not going to get another word in. So what I want to say is, like, when we think about politics, we tend to, when we're working within the frame of just everyday American neoliberal or just capitalist politics, we tend to approach it as if what matters most is changing the ideas that are out there in the world. You can hear it on the left when it was talk about, now people will talk about socialism for the first time. We've expanded the Overton window. We've got to stamp out the bad ideas that have gripped a portion of our population and the deplorables. But what we were talking about at the beginning of this episode was the economy, what I would call the real, which was difficult to wrestle with, which we didn't fully know. We have all these indicators, but we can't put all the pieces together perfectly. We can kind of get a sense of what's happening. So when I read your article, it's this very high theory article calling for us to return to a politics that will engage with the material productive capitalist world, and not reify that away or act as if we simply can never get to what capitalism is, or we can never get to what the real is, and we just have to operate on the level of our own interior ideas. Am I right? Is this what the stakes are for your theory?
The stakes are, I don't know if I understood correctly. I may have misunderstood completely, but I would say the stakes are the opposite, actually. We can access the real. We can ground our thought in practice and materialist thinking, or consideration of matter and materiality. That's the idea. So
I think you did get me wrong. I was saying that the bad politics of the moment would say we can't access capitalism, but we can have a politics based on addressing capitalism. So that is those are the stakes.
So that can bring us to the question of the concrete finally, which was your question all along. The concrete, that Ilyenkov discusses in his dialectics, is something that is taken from Marx's own writing, where he writes of the concrete and the abstract, which is a passage from Grundrisse, several passages from Grundrisse that I can read here in order to explain the idea. What is Marx's idea, and then what kind of Ilyenkov pushes further, is the following. Marx asks us to move away from the abstraction and start thinking in terms of the concrete. But in the end, we know Marx's work, we know Capital. In the end, we end up with this very sterile, very precise abstractions, formulae in the Capital, in all of the volumes. So what Marx proposes when he says move away from the abstraction, discuss departing from the concrete, yet again arrive at certain other abstractions, but ones that are grounded in the material, he proposes the following: move away from what I would call the spontaneously philosophical abstractions. Like he gives examples there in Grund 3 second. Read the passage, like population or wealth or whatever. And he says, let's look what's behind these abstractions, which are in fact generalizations. I can find a German term in a bit, which are in fact generalizations that are not examined properly. Let's arrive at the concrete, which we mean when we refer to these abstractions. We will probably arrive at compounds of concretes. He does use this expression, compounds of concretes, and the concrete is yet another concept. It's yet another concept, but one that departs from the closest approximation of the real of the real behind the notions that we're discussing here or operating with here. It's best if I read the quote, I think, in order to render it more clear. So these concretes are very banal, you know. It's like we can take the example of what Marx himself does in order to illustrate this movement of thought that he proposes. Let's look at the Capital. He discusses some very banal examples of, I don't know, silk and wheat and whatever, products that will be commodified, etc. Prices. This is a very banal and very concrete at the same time discussion. But this concreteness is still a concept. It's still a notion. So we, as I said at the beginning, let's use Lacan to illustrate what we mean by the real here. So the real is here. We are approximating the real with certain concepts that can, that can in a way be its symptoms. Let's use Lacan's language again in order to simplify the discussion, which can be in a way it's more or less direct symptoms, exemplified or materialized paradoxically in science. In signification, in language. So let's arrive at concepts that are as close as possible to the real and the material behind it. Like, I don't know, the silk costs this much, and if I trade it for that much, blah, 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 I arrive at this formula. So this is the concreteness. So the concrete is, again, a certain concept. Or we can borrow something from somebody that one could perhaps never relate to Marxism, except one person, Karatani, Cohen Karatani. He has related this thinker to Marxism. That's Ferdinand de Saussure, who also pleads to move away from abstraction, to get rid of abstraction, in order to, departing from the concrete, once again arrive back at the abstraction. If you remember this famous passage in his course on linguistics, he says the ideal P does not exist. We have minus P plus, no, this stands for bigger and smaller. I don't know the word in English. So we have this imperfect P's in all of this Indo-European languages, but from them we can derive the idea and or the idea of the ideal P, with which we can operate in science. So it's both real in a way, or it's in relation to the real, this ideal P. It can have real effect on our thinking. It can be productive in scientific exploration of languages. Still, we admit that it doesn't exist in, the reality outside. So it is in this sense. I could perhaps liken this passage in Ilienkov on the concrete and the passage in Marx on the concrete to this example from Zon Reitel, because I think that these ideas that are closer to our time help better understand what is meant by
So,
that. By that
our editor-in-chief of Sublation Magazine did join the stream a little while ago.
Yeah.
I tried to pretend like I didn't see him at first because I wanted to get a question in, but I see you now, Spencer. I recognize you, you must have had something you wanted to ask or something you wanted to say. So go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Katerina.
Hi.
When I was reading your piece, there are all these echoes of passages from Marx, and I think particularly from the Grundrisse. Certainly, that's what occurred to me, and I thought maybe to help people understand what you're talking about, we could refer directly to those fairly well-known passages. So you keep talking about Marx on the concrete, and I take you to be speaking about the section in the introduction to the Grundrisse that we know in English as the method of political economy.
Yeah.
Right. And so I was wondering, there Marx is talking about how bourgeois thought developed abstractions in thinking about society. It really came to think about society for the first time. Right. So he says, in the 17th century, they began to contemplate society. They looked at things like the population. They came up with categories and eventually arrived at value, money, price, division of labor, these sorts of vast abstractions. Right. And so I guess what I'm wondering is, what's the difference in the way, and of course, Marx is, tacking back and forth there between political economy and Hegel, and, talking about it in Hegelian terms, in terms of Hegelian philosophy as a way of understanding society, or, and in that sense, a kind of response to or development of political economy. I'm wondering, how do we think about Marx's relationship to bourgeois thought, right? So in other words, it's not just Marx coming up with abstractions. He's already dealing with a vast system of abstractions, right? All of the the vast majority, shall we say, at minimum, of the categories of capital are categories that Marx doesn't come up with, like the commodity, use value, exchange value. So what's the difference between, the Marxian relationship to political, how do we understand the relationship of Marx to political economy and to Hegelian philosophy? Because, Marx is, a dialectical critic of these already existing bourgeois forms.
So I do think that Marx really parts ways with Hegel from the beginning, and he never returns to Hegel in any way that would mean, a rehabilitation or, reinvention of Hegel's thought that could serve historical materialism, as Marx used to call it, not dialectical materialism. So that's another reason why I'm distinguishing. I'm, taking apart the unity of dialectical materialism. I'm talking about dialectics and materialism. Sorry, Spencer.
I was wondering, are you following Althusser in that respect, in terms of kind of an Althusserian conception of science as a break?
Well, I don't think that there is a break. That's the whole thing. I think
Do
that
you like Hegel more than you like Marx, or do you like Marx more than you like
Marx
Hegel?
more than Hegel. I dislike Hegel.
Okay.
Marx, of course. So
And yet you like the Grundrisse, which is probably the most Hegelian text.
I
Anyway,
wouldn't say so. I wouldn't say so. How many mentions are there of Hegel in that book?
Yeah, but the form of it
You
is
have
really
to read
Hegelian.
between
There's
the
just
lines.
one which is not negative. Well, you have to read between the lines, but if you don't read between the lines, but to the letter, I wouldn't say so. Spencer, no, I'm closer to Francois Laruelle, Francois Laruelle's non-philosophy. Everybody says, and it's kind of evident, I agree with everybody who says so, that it is close to Althusser's reading of Marx, except except there are some radical differences still between Laruelle and Althusser. Althusser remains a philosopher even according to Laruelle, even when he doesn't wish to be one. Then again, according to Laruelle, there has never been a break in Marx. He has always been a scientist or an aspiring scientist in his thinking. I would say I'm grounding my reading of Marx in his earliest work, in his dissertation, and his doctoral dissertation, which is a radical vindication of materialism. Dialectics appears to be used there more closely to the manner in which it is used by the Greek philosophers, in particular Aristotle than Hegel, I believe, even though early Marx was still under a strong influence from Hegel, of course, there. So there is one part there about the form in the atom, which kind of sounds Hegelian, where he talks about the atom reaching its atom sexualization by reaching its form, its ideal form. That's a moment where he sounds like Hegel a little bit, but he moves on immediately to a further discussion in which he insists that this ideal form is again merely an effect of material processes, and an effect of this necessarily or material processes and the laws of matter that govern.
So I have another question about as good as who do you like better, Marx or Hegel?
Mhm.
So as simple minded, when one of the big proponents of Lacan these days, one of the big interpreters of Lacan, of course, is Slavoj Žižek, who I've talked to, and he either is bringing Lacan to Hegel or making Lacan into a Hegelian. What do you make of Zizek's Hegelian Lacan, and is it different from the Lacan that would have influenced Althusser and influenced you, perhaps?
I quite like his reading of Lacan. His use of the notion of the real there in Lacan. I like how Alenka Župančić is taking it further. So I like that aspect of his work. I really disagree about, the weight he puts on, the importance of it's not his fault, it's the doctrine of Diamant of Hegel for the development of Marx's thought. And I don't find in Zizek a lot of Marx or Marxism, to be honest. If you read his work, there is hardly any mention of Marx or any discussion of Marx's writings there. There is this proclamation of him being a Marxist, but I don't see it in the text itself. There is one book that is inaccessible to you because it's in Serbo-Croatian, which was published in Belgrade just, a couple of years before the dissolution of Yugoslavia. There you find a bit more Marx, but he was, it was a must in these institutes back then to simply include Marx, even though you didn't feel like, working on Marx. And this book, Znak označitelj pisma, sign signifier l'écriture, that would be the translation in half English, half French, seems like, he was interested in something completely different in the French theory of the era, and not quite so much in Marx. Marx is just, Marx sporadically appears here and there, as one had to do it back then, in order to defend the thesis in Yugoslavia. So that's the only Marx I have read in Zizek. I don't know. I see a lot of Hegel, but I don't see Marx and his combination of Marx with Hegel. So, but it's not just about Zizek. It's the dialectical doctrine. It's always been like that since the 30s. Hegel has been central, and it's very, very difficult now to dismantle this tradition or this, like spontaneous assumptions we have about the relevance of Hegel for Marxist work. Therefore, we have to go back to Marx himself. So Spencer, maybe it's close to what I'm proposing is maybe close, has a certain proximity in ideas with Althusser, but not quite. As I said, it's more close to Laruelle. After all, I'm a Laruellian, a Laruelle student. But I would say it comes, this reading that I just proposed and the one that I am discussing in my book on the animals published by Bloomsbury in 2000, Bloomsbury Academic in the UK in 2019. I don't go via anybody anymore, neither via Althusser, not really via Laruelle anymore. I'm reading the original text. I'm also a classicist. I have also a background in classics, so I can read the sources he discusses in his original, in his dissertation. And I would say in this latest book, I depart mainly from there, from my classical training and from the Marx's original text, and that's it. In the previous book, it's mainly Marx's original text and a little bit of this conceptual or methodological instrumentarium provided by Laruelle, and that would be it. And if there is any Althusser there, it's probably indirectly through Laruelle.
Can you stick around for the second stream?
Yeah.
Do you have time? All right.
Yeah.
So we'll bring you on to the second stream. Right now, I'm going to close this out because we're just over an hour, and I don't want to give the people too much for free. I mean, I have to take it to Patreon. So thank you very much for showing up. And Spencer, thank you for jumping in with the question. You're going to be around in the second hour as well, right?
Yes? Sure.
All right.
And Ted Reese as well. I've asked that he
Ted
come
Reese
and join us. So if you are interested in that and you want to ask Ted some questions and Katerina some questions, come and join us for that.
Yeah. So, I think that what our task will be in the second hour is to try to bring the question of dialectical materialism or historical materialism or Laruelle or Althusser or Rothel to bear on our economic conditions, our real, I'm going to say real conditions, even though I think reality can be changed because I'm a science fiction writer. So,
also, if I could just toss in a little plug, if anyone was listening and was just totally lost, I highly recommend a book by, it's an old book and it's very niche. I'm going to say the name wrong, but anyway, it's Franz Jakubowski. I'm sure it's pronounced Jakubowski or something, but it's called Ideology and Superstructure and Historical Materialism. Highly recommend the Pluto Press version from 1990 with the red and black cover. It explains things so clearly, so very, very clearly, some of these questions. And in the Parrot Room, I'm going to try to talk a little bit about it if I can, kind of slide that in.
All right, that sounds great. So I'm going to close it out here, and thank you all for watching.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases